this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
The Liberal Prime Minister has lost control of spending, and he's lost control of his own cabinet. The outgoing Finance Minister promised that a massive $40 billion deficit would be her fiscal guardrail, but it looks like the Prime Minister and the incoming Finance Minister, Carbon Tax Carney, are pushing her through the guardrail and over the fiscal cliff with the rest of Canadians. So will the Prime Minister stand up today and admit that he's having his outgoing Finance Minister take the fall so that he can replace her with Carbon Tax Carney?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
They are trying to distract from their voting record, Mr. Speaker. In this House of Commons, when this government put forward legislation, affirmed last night by the Senate, in fact, to cut GST for families looking to buy kids' clothes, diapers, car seats, families that want to go out to a restaurant, someone who wants to buy beer or cider. They're against that, Mr. Speaker. Shameful. Lots of slogans when it comes to cutting taxes, but that's all they have, Mr. Speaker. Empty slogans. When it comes down to it, we put a tax cut forward, and they voted against it.
Right on. The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
A tiny 2-month tax trick is not going to help the more than 2 million Canadians lined up at food banks every month, or pennies off of Pepsi for Canadians who are going to pay $800 more for groceries in 2025. So this Prime Minister is forcing his outgoing Finance Minister to take the fall for the effects of his inflationary spending that's pushing his $40 billion deficit guardrail right to past and over the cliff. So will the Prime Minister admit that it is in fact his inflationary spending that's the cause of this massive deficit?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of Housing.
The lowest debt and deficit in the G7, Mr. Speaker. A 5th consecutive interest rate decline. What is that? That is good news, Mr. Speaker, for business owners looking to expand. It's good news for mortgage holders looking to renew, families looking to buy a home, Mr. Speaker, and there's many other examples. They want to distract from their record. In fact, think about the Harper years. The worst rate of economic growth had Stephen Harper going back to R.B. Bennett in the 1930s, Mr. Speaker. They're not serious about these things.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Good news. He's talking about good news like Canadians have never had it so good. The highest household debt because Canadians can't afford to pay their mortgages. They can't afford to feed themselves. They can't afford to heat their homes or put gas in their cars after 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister who said that the budget would balance itself, that he doesn't think about monetary policy, and it should be the bankers that worry about the economy. Even his caucus is calling for some fiscal sanity after 9 years of his economic vandalism. When the deficit smashes through $40 billion, will at least he allow his caucus to have a free vote?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
He talks about people at food banks, Mr. Speaker. We're not insensitive to that. Canadians have had a hard time. What has this government done? We've supported them through the pandemic. We continue to show support, Mr. Speaker. They want to cut their pensions. They want to cut employment insurance. We have a school food program, in fact, that is supporting no less than 400,000 kids in 4 different provinces. They voted against that too, Mr. Speaker. Shameful. The Canada Child Benefit, today parents will see a direct deposit put into their account. Guess what? They're also against that, Mr. Speaker. They don't care.
Yes.
The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
The fundamental role of Parliament is that no money shall be spent without the consent of Parliament. It's right in the Constitution. You might want to take a look. It's been 8 months since the year end, and the Liberals still haven't tabled the deficit number. The Liberals are 2 months late in tabling the public accounts. Bay Street, not Parliament, learned yesterday that the government has sold $3 billion of Air Canada shares. They are blocking Parliament from doing its work. They must have blown by their maximum $40 billion deficit promise massively. Come clean. What's the deficit number?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing and Communities.
The member knows very well, Mr. Speaker, that during the pandemic, this government provided loan support and other support for Air Canada to ensure its long-term viability. Part of that was buying shares in the company. It was never, though, the intention of the Government of Canada to hold on to those shares into the long term. It made a sale yesterday, and it was a responsible one. Again, and the question has been asked. The Minister of Health put it forward. The Minister of Labour put it forward. What would they cut? What would they cut to ensure that the budget, as they say, is fixed? They'd cut dental care, child care, pharmacare supports. They don't care, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Today, the Minister of Labour stepped into the Canada Post strike. The Workers' Union said, and I quote, "It denounces in the strongest terms this assault on our constitutionally protected rights." Even the NDP leader said the Liberals will, and I quote, "always step in to make sure unions have no power." On Monday, the NDP leader put his pension before country and workers and voted confidence in the Liberals. Will the government confirm it has ordered workers back to work? And what is the price Liberals paid to keep NDP leader propping up this anti-worker government?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, we acted decisively today to offer a creative solution to the labour dispute between Canada Post and its workers. That constitutionally protected right to strike has been exercised for 4 weeks. If workers were not to be on picket lines for some indefinite period over the holidays, a solution had to be brought. We work for all Canadians in this House. Canadians were suffering. Small businesses were suffering. Indigenous and remote regions were suffering, Mr. Speaker. The government had to act, and that's what I did this morning.
Carbon tax carnies, Canadian comeback fueled a fiscal feud for this furious finance minister. The Prime Minister forced the finance minister to crash through the $40 billion deficit guardrail promise. The PBO says it'll be at least over $6 billion. Now that the Prime Minister is done using her, he'll dump her for carbon tax carney. Will the Prime Minister confirm once he fires his finance minister, the deficit won't be a penny over $46 billion?
Good question.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While that member practices on things that rhyme with F words, our minister actually renegotiated NAFTA with Trump. Our minister introduced supports during a global pandemic to keep businesses and people going. Our minister tomorrow will see a GST tax breaks for Canadians. So while Conservatives practice their rhymes, we're delivering real supports for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Their minister is the reason why Canada's economy is crapping out. And just to take dimes off of Doritos, they'll crash the deficit guardrail, taking Canada's finances off a cliff. The Prime Minister forced the Finance Minister to implement it. The PBO confirmed that they're already $6 billion past that fiscal guardrail. Canadians want to know how bad carbon tax carney and the Prime Minister will smash through the $40 billion deficit guardrail. How bad is it? What is the deficit number?
Yeah, what is it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear that when the Conservatives have no real argument or debate, they just insult people. Because on this side of the House, our finance minister has a record of helping people in some of the hardest times that this country has ever faced. A global pandemic, global inflation. We saw another interest rate cut just this week, and tomorrow we will see more tax breaks for Canadians. Something Conservatives promised they'd do, but weren't able to. So what is it, Mr. Speaker? Is it the fact that it's our plan we're actually implementing, or they can't stand it's a woman doing it?
The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peter. Order. We made it into 12 questions before we really got too much noise here. Not bad. This is a record, I'm sure. This must be a record. The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Consensus among economists, experts, and even the parliamentary budget officers is that the government has exceeded all of its fiscal anchors. The only question is, how badly have they failed? Can the government confirm whether the Minister of Finance has gone way past the guardrails or whether they've gone completely off the cliff with a $46 billion deficit?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
The member should expand beyond the Fraser Institute, Mr. Speaker, and look to, for example, what the International Monetary Fund has said, what other lead financial authorities have said in the business press and elsewhere. the parliamentary budget officer as well. Canada has a very sustainable fiscal situation, the lowest debt in the G7, the lowest deficit in the G7, a AAA credit rating, Mr. Speaker. And what do we see on the Conservative side? A plan to make cuts, including a plan to cut $10 million for housing in Peterborough, his community, Mr. Speaker. What do you have to say to that?
The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Well, let's return to the facts here. The current and former Governor of Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, and Steve Pelosi agree the Canadian economy is in big trouble. The phantom finance minister's economic plan is failing Canadians. The sad part is these Liberals don't even know how badly. So can someone go behind the curtain on the other side and simply ask Carbon Tax Carney what the deficit is?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I know this member, he's an honourable member, and I know that he cares about his community. A few weeks ago, I spoke with Peterborough's Mayor Jeff Leal, a good man, someone who cares about his community and is doing a great job in that city. I told him about the government's plan to invest over $10 million through the Housing Accelerator Fund to build more housing. The Conservatives want to cut that investment, among others. Will he join the other Conservative MPs who are advocating for the Accelerator Fund to ensure that more homes get built? I hope that he does, Mr. Speaker. The Mayor is asking.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Speaker, the Prime Minister has lost control of his spending and his cabinet. The PBO says that this year's budget deficit could be as high as $46 billion, smashing the $40 billion guardrail promised by the Finance Minister. And like so many ministers before her, this Finance Minister's time might be limited simply for standing up to the Prime Minister and his radical agenda. Will the Prime Minister confirm that he is ignoring his Prime Minister's $40 billion guardrail promise and tell us if the deficit will exceed $46 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Throughout today, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have launched personal attacks on the Finance Minister, who's responsible for, among other things, the Canada Child Benefit, who's responsible for, among other things, ensuring that childcare is a priority in this country, moving towards $10 a day. What has that done in this country for its economy? Among other things, 110,000 women have been able to re-enter the workforce because childcare has now moved to an affordable level. They want to cancel that, Mr. Speaker. They say all these things about families. In the end, they don't care about families, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Speaker, from that answer, it's clear that the Liberals have abandoned all hope of keeping their $40 billion guardrail promise that was made to Canadians. While the unelected, unaccountable, and phantom Finance Minister, Carbon Tax Carney, pulls the strings from the shadows, the Liberals are following their Prime Minister and the economy of Canada right off the fiscal cliff. Already, interest charges on our debt will cost taxpayers more than the Fed send to the provinces in healthcare. So will the Prime Minister confirm that the deficit will not be over $46 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, there's some really good news. Last night, the Senate of Canada passed the legislation that's going to give a GST tax break starting tomorrow for all Canadians in all regions of the country, Mr. Speaker. That is actually good news. That is something in which the Conservatives campaigned on, but oops, they actually voted against it, Mr. Speaker. They're the Grinch of Christmas, Mr. Speaker, whereas we are giving a tax break during the holiday season. That is good news.
Mr. Speaker, we're talking about what could be more than $40 billion. A carbon-taxing, coal-loving Carney, a finance minister on the run, a prime minister not into monetary policy. They hike taxes, they fuel inflation, they crash through the fiscal guardrails and off the cliff. This government is a chaotic clown show. Which one of them will call a carbon tax election?
Just to make sure everybody's, just watch the words that they use. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, we see the Conservatives dive into insults because they actually have no plan for the economy. And I think they just can't stand the fact that we have a finance minister who was able to renegotiate NAFTA with the previous Trump administration. We were able to see supports being delivered to businesses and Canadians through the worst global pandemic. And, Mr. Speaker, we continue to see interest rates drop. And tomorrow we see a tax break for all Canadians. So while they want to know about a free vote, I'm wondering if they'll have a free question.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
The Finance Minister admitted that deficits cause inflation. She promised that she would cap Canada's deficit at an already crazy $40 billion and wouldn't go a penny over. Now the Prime Minister is pressuring her to spend even more by pushing through her own guardrail and making her fall off a fiscal cliff. Is the Prime Minister going to pressure this female finance minister to read Conflict of Interest Carbon Tax Carney's fiscal update and blame her for breaking the $40 billion deficit promise?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I repeat the lowest debt and deficit in the G7. The PBO coming out and affirming that we have a very fiscally sustainable situation. What would the Conservatives do? They would make cuts. And in fact, the member, with all due respect to her, ought to go and listen to what the mayor of Kelowna recently said. The Conservatives are proposing cuts for housing. That would mean less money for Kelowna. In fact, he's worried that because of those prospective cuts, that Kelowna would have to increase property taxes and go into the reserves. The Conservative plan is a plan to increase property taxes, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've seen the fake feminist Prime Minister do this before, pushing strong women out of cabinet. Yet the Prime Minister's hypocrisy is on display as he lectures about him being a proud feminist. The Globe and Mail reported on the Prime Minister's aggressive recruitment of Conflict of Interest Carbon Tax Carney as tensions increase with the current finance minister. So will the fake feminist Prime Minister park the hypocrisy and admit his inflationary spending is forcing the finance minister to break her $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we hear the word feminist being thrown around this place in the most disrespectful way, and it is rich that the Conservative Party claims to care about women. Maybe they should stand up to their own leader who contributes to the misogyny that increases hate towards women by embedding misogynistic hashtags into his YouTube videos. We won't take any lessons from the party across.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
The finance minister actually admits deficits cause inflation. She promised a cap of an already wacko $40 billion, but the prime minister bullied to crash her through that so-called guardrail with billions more. He sets her up to take the fall, and Canadians will pay the price. Now, like a long line of women, the prime minister kicks her to the curb for his conflict of interest carbon tax crony Carney. Is the prime minister really going to bully his female finance minister to read carbon tax Carney's fiscal update and then blame her for breaking the $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, this is a minister who stood up to Putin, who renegotiated trade deals with the U.S., who worked and helped Canadians get through a global health pandemic. Mr. Speaker, she doesn't get bullied, but it seems that perhaps the Conservative caucus is projecting the fact that if they don't read the Conservative leaders' lines, if they don't rhyme enough, they don't get question time. So while we are working and focused on providing tax relief to Canadians, Conservatives are making sure they rack up those gold stars.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Look, we all know the Prime Minister says women experience him differently, but it's his pattern to elbow them to the side, and it's sad to see a woman spinning for him. He's incompetent, unaccountable, and bullies subordinate women, blames and shames them, then replaces them with his buddies. He's aggressively recruited carbon tax Carney, yet calls himself a proud feminist. Canadians can't afford this. Will this complete weak fake stop all the hypocrisy and admit his inflationary spending forces the finance minister to break her $40 billion deficit promise?
The Honourable Minister.
if the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, want to talk about feminism, here's some policies that our government has done to support women across this country. Policies like $10 a day childcare that has thousands of women back in the workforce because they can now do so. The National Action Plan to end gender-based violence that is helping women get true freedom from those that would hurt them and harm them. True freedom, autonomy over our bodies, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives have opposed every single measure we have put forward to help women in this country, and they continue to do so.
Bull River.
Thank you. Things are getting real bad behind closed doors for the languishing Liberal government. The Prime Minister is once again looking for someone to take the fall for his fiscal fiasco. This time, the Minister of Finance has been targeted for removal, so carbon tax Carney can come out from behind the shadows and replace her. Their $40 billion so-called deficit guardrail looks like it's about to be smashed through, sending our economy off the cliff. Will the Prime Minister keep his promise, confirm the deficit will not be over $40 billion?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
More personal attacks today, Mr. Speaker. Under this Minister of Health and under this Minister of Finance, we've seen a national dental care program put in place. 3 million plus Canadians have signed on. Over 1 million have received care, Mr. Speaker. Many are seniors. In fact, seniors were the first to be offered care. Are the Conservatives saying that as part of this big, bold idea, more of a slogan, Mr. Speaker, in fact, to fix the budget, they'd get rid of dental care? Yep. That's exactly what they would do, Mr. Speaker. When it comes down to it, as I've said throughout today, they do not care. They care about slogans, but they don't care about Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Bull River.
The Prime Minister lost control of his caucus, just like he lost control of our economy. And their benches are clearing of people left to blame. But it's not stopping the Liberal government from smashing through their own stated deficit guardrail, their fiscal anchor. Whatever they want to call it, the guardrail is about to be smashed. Canada's economy is careening off the cliff and sinking fast. So will the Prime Minister please just stop drowning us in debt, confirm the next week's deficit, and won't shoot over $40 billion and capsize Canada?
Here. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, children's clothes, diapers, car seats, board games, prepared food, snacks, video games, children's toys will all cost 13% less tomorrow in Ontario, thanks to our GST tax break that our Liberal government brought forward, Mr. Speaker. While the Conservatives sat down and voted no against this tax savings for Canadian families, we understand that this time of year is hard on families. We want to continue to be there to support them. If you're planning on taking your family out for dinner, that's 13% less in Ontario. That's what we'll continue to do. We'll continue supporting families in Ontario. So starting tomorrow, there'll be a GST tax break for all families across Canada.
The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has lost control of spending and even his own cabinet. He is pushing his Finance Minister to smash through her $40 billion deficit guardrail. All the while, reports indicate he is planning to fire her and replace her with carbon tax Carney. Now, Mr. Speaker, $40 billion would already be a massively irresponsible deficit, but the PBO says it could even go as high as $46 billion. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister confirm today that the deficit will not be a penny over $46 billion?
Great question. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, I think we sit in this place and we hear Conservatives ask the same question written by their leader over and over and over again. That question has been asked and answered dozens of times in this House. So I have a question for my Conservative friends back. They seem very concerned about deficits. Can they offer one thing? One. Where are they going to start cutting, Mr. Speaker? Be specific.
Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, today the Canada Post strike is a month old and there's no end in sight. This essential service to small businesses is absent during critical sales period needed for their survival. Two obstinate groups hold Canada hostage while the Liberals, desperate to cling to power, are afraid to lose NDP support by ending the strike. Both should know that there are no workers to unionize or taxpayers to tax without employers. And this government's failure to act is harming Canada's top employers and our economy. Mr. Speaker, will the government do its job, put Canada first, stop hiding behind the CIRB, and end this strike?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Well, the job of the Minister of Labour is to respect the Canada Labour Code. That is exactly what we've done, and today I acted decisively to use one of the powers granted to the Minister of Labour by this Parliament under the Canada Labour Code to provide a reasonable solution to workers and a creative way out of this very fundamental impasse that we see at the bargaining table. We're going to return Canada Post services to Canadians and to those who've been suffering over this conflict, and hopefully arrive at a negotiated collective agreement by the spring, Mr. Speaker.
And that's all the time we have for question period today.